Hello, everyone. I'm going to begin with a very brief introduction to COVE Studio and COVE Edition. So I'm going to share my screen here. Hope you can all see that. So COVE actually is two different spaces, and I want to make clear the difference between the two just so that everybody is on the same page here. So we've purposefully separated out these two places, one COVE Studio, one COVE Editions. Studio is where we are keeping all of the texts that we've been encoding, and these are the primary texts. Over the summer, we're planning to add in a lot of paratextual, head notes, etc., that can also be added to an anthology. And it's a place where you can very quickly build an anthology, draw from at the moment, almost 6 million words of content, like a 20-volume encyclopedia worth of material that you can add to a course anthology, and then annotate with students. And you can also upload your own texts. The reason to keep that password protected, there are multiple reasons. You annotate with students, and students don't intend their annotations to be world readable, so it's a way to protect their privacy, and they can annotate on their own without anybody seeing their annotations, or they click a button that says that they want others in the class to share, and you are in control of that. You're in control of your anthology. Each anthology you build has its own URL, so it's very easy to incorporate into a learning management system, as I'll show you, and you control who can see each other's annotations within a group. It also, since it's nonprofit, COVE is nonprofit, COVE Studio is educational, and it's not world readable, there's a very strong argument, especially in the United States. These rules vary country to country, but in the US, that is a very strong argument for fair use of the material that gets uploaded to COVE Studio, and you're able to upload your own material to add to your anthology, which I'll show you. And Studio is also our main path to sustainability. Our goal is to, our hope is that eventually most people will access these texts through institutional subscription. Right now, people pay $10 each, like if you do it as a class, each student pays $10. This is just a way to support COVE, which is a nonprofit. I'm trying to learn from the lessons of working with the Nines Project, which was wonderfully successful at pulling together grants, over $4 million worth in the end. They even had a tenure line associated with it, but it was all tied to the University of Virginia. And it just took a change of dean and a change of president to suddenly go from very well endowed project to very little money for it. So this is a way with COVE to think about how best to approach it as a collective. Project Collective is in the name. We have a consortium of universities that are providing graduate student labor, and that's how we've been able to put together such a large collection of material so quickly. All of our material is properly formatted, line numbers for poetry, for example, ADA compliant. And the consortium is large. It includes, I'll even forget names, but Rutgers, University of Chicago, University of Florida, University of Delaware, Purdue, University of Nebraska, Texas Christian, Ryerson, University of Alberta, Carleton, Birkbeck, Queen Mary, University of Exeter, University of Birmingham. I probably missed one, but anyway, a large consortium that provides us with graduate students who we train, and those students also gain skills that they can make use of in their own careers, either within the academy or in diverse career tracks. Jenna Herdman is here, and she's a good example since she was just hired as a program officer for SHRC, and largely built on her skills that she gained at COVE. And the institutional subscriptions that we're now starting to establish help us to support the larger mission of COVE, and Purdue was the first. This is Princeton's instance of COVE Studio. This is the University of Alabama's, and we just added the University of Chicago. Ryerson is our newest one, and we don't have a site for it yet even, which is why I was just addressing the faculty yesterday. The subscription model is our way, so the consortium model supports our labor. The subscription model is our long-term way of thinking about sustainability. And the goal is ultimately to support also the COVE edition side. And that's where we assemble the critical editions, which is what this seminar, this workshop is all about. So hopefully we can have enough funds coming in that we can support all of the costs of maintaining this and can support editions that you might want to build. COVE Editions has critical editions that go through peer review and copy editing, but it's also a site where you can do open access publishing of anything. You could do that with your students without any intention of putting it through the peer review pipeline, simply to provide information or teach them about how to go about disseminating knowledge to the world at large. So that's the basic idea. The goal is in part to deal with the humanities crisis, especially in publishing, which we've heard about since Stephen Greenblatt's letter of 2003. It's gotten no better since he wrote that. And so this is a way to provide a pipeline for people who want to share knowledge, and especially with editions that presses will no longer consider touching, just because so much has been oriented towards the undergraduate classroom instead. The problem also exists on the side of libraries. So it became very clear to me how serious this problem was when I was president of the North American Victorian Studies Association. We had arranged for ProQuest to give our members 1 month of access to its databases. And I heard so many stories of people staying up all night trying to gain access to the database while they still could. But it's a real problem. So many scholar institutions cannot pay for the access to the incredibly expensive access to these databases, with the price going up much higher than the rate of inflation. It's not a very sustainable model for libraries either. So COVE was, and I actually started a Mellon-funded effort, me and Elaine Friedgood, to try to create a virtual university made up of field societies that could gain scholars access to these databases. Commercial providers in the end were not willing to play ball. They're just interested in making money. They weren't willing to see their library subscription model in any way possibly threatened. And so that initiative failed, and COVE is the direct result of that effort. An alternative, a nonprofit alternative, priced more fairly than commercial provider databases, again, still oriented to libraries. So the problem, I think, is put really well by Robert Darnton. So I should say that, university libraries were already in crisis well before the coronavirus upended university budgets and library budgets. And Robert Darnton put it well when, in 2012, Harvard Libraries stopped many of its subscriptions to databases from commercial providers. He was head of Harvard Libraries when he wrote, "I hope that other universities will take similar action. We all face the same paradox. We faculty do the research, write the papers, referee papers by other researchers, serve on editorial boards, all of it for free. And then we buy back the results of our labor at outrageous prices. The system is absurd, and it is inflicting terrible damage on libraries. In the long run, the answer will be open access publishing, but we need concerted effort to reach that goal." So this is one effort, among others, to try to provide an alternative for open access publishing. Oops, I forgot to click my button for that. So as I say, one part of that sustainability plan is to provide subscriptions for universities. That means that you can log in, if your library subscribes, in the same way you log into email or Eduroam. So Purdue, for example, has two-factor authentication, and that's how you enter into the Purdue version of the database, which my class is using now for our edition. But we'll always have $10 per user access. That's not a very sustainable model because it's very expensive to run something like this, but we never want to deny someone the ability to make use of these tools. So what can COVE Studio help you do? Well, for one, you can create a custom anthology by drawing on our database. I'll show you how easy it is to do that. So this is, again, this was my spiel to Ryerson yesterday. That's why I have this Ryerson image there. But you can personalize it by adding an image. And once you create your anthology, It appears in your dashboard, which you see here, and clicking on it, from there, that's the image I picked, you can quickly add in any texts that we have available. So for example, we just finished encoding Shakespeare's Tempest and are actually doing a number of Shakespeare plays that should be ready by the fall. Our collection is strongest in the 19th century because that's where we started. Especially if you do teach 19th century texts, there's a lot there for you to choose from. Let's say you're interested in the Restoration or Afro Ben. We have a few of those. And if we don't have it, you can always request that we encode it. Our goal eventually is to encode everything. So everything is on our list. Any request simply brings an item up to the top. If you're a modernist, there's a wolf text, and then you can see all of the texts. And your students see the same list after you add them in. Our texts are properly formatted, as you can see here, with plays properly presented, poetry, with line numbers, and again, everything is ADA compliant. You can sort alphabetically by clicking on title or by clicking on author. And you're in control of your of who accesses your anthology and who sees each other's annotations. So you just have to find your students after they've logged into the database and assign them to your anthology. And it's good to assign yourself as well, which I'm doing here. If I click on all, I assign myself, and then when I click on all, you see that there are just 2 people assigned to this particular anthology. So that's how the anthology works. You can use it for a class. Of course, you can also use it for an edition that you do with other scholars, or the hybrid example that we are in the process of doing now, where with my grad class, we are now building an edition of Amour de Voyage. You can also upload your own texts, as I mentioned. So here's that anthology again. Let's say something that isn't available and I need it immediately. I can go to my dashboard and create a document on my own. We encourage people to paste directly into the form here. You can also access the code behind it, but we have this WYSIWYG, so you can just quickly copy and paste so that you have a very easy, quick way to add material. You have this WYSIWYG interface that allows you to add in headers, etc. You put in a little bit of metadata so you can find it later, including the author name, last name first, and the rights status. Once you set it to annotatable, you can't go back and change the base text, so you want to make sure you're happy with what you have put together, but it's that easy to create a document. And as soon as you have, if you go back to your dashboard and into your anthology and recall we did a search for Ben a little while ago. If I do a search now, you'll see there's The Dream, marked as not vetted because it does not follow our coding standards. It's not ADA compliant, client doesn't have line numbers, but it is there available for annotation with the 2 people that you see there that I assigned to this anthology. So it's that easy to access material. We're very happy to give you our coding guidelines if you want to try to do, if you want to add proper formatting on your own, but we're also happy to do it for you. So that's the upload function. We make it very easy then to annotate with text or with other scholars. There's Lewis Carroll, for example. As you see, if images are important for the text, we've included them. And we make it very easy to click on groups there, and you can see all the annotations from this particular class. You just click on one to be taken directly to that part in the text itself. So that's annotation. Finally, what's nice about the annotation function is that you can very easily add in images, audio, film. So for example, here's the Tempest I showed you. Let's say I wanted to add in an image of Shakespeare. All I need to do is find a JPEG somewhere out on the web, and there's so many of them thanks to Wikipedia. So you just find the original JPEG. You have to click on the first time you see that image. That's a wrapper. So you have to click on it again to get to the JPEG file, paste it in, click on that button to make it available for view by the people in this group. It's that easy to add in an image. Once you start playing with this, you realize just how neat that is. Especially if you have a text that, for example, is linked up with a lot of art historical elements. as is the case for the edition I'll show you that we're putting together. And we've really been enjoying using audio for our edition as well, and I'll show you that in a second. You can also, each time you create an anthology, what you're actually doing is creating a unique URL. So you see there it says Ryerson Anthology. That's the name of the anthology we built. That means that I can just enter a link into my LMS. We use Brightspace, and if you're logged into both, you have a seamless transition. This is my class from the fall, and these are my actual student annotations from the fall. You can see my students there. You can sort, filter by students. You can find just what one student had to do. You can see they made use of the image function. One of them said, "Isn't that the same George III who was in Hamilton?" So I was able to quickly drop in a clip of that.
George Washington's yielding his power and stepping away. Is that true?
So very neat, as you can, it really helps with conversation with the students. And in fact, it's excellent for conversation, whether you're online or face-to-face. And it's really good for first-generation students, minority students, anybody who feels uncomfortable maybe speaking face-to-face, or like that, that A student that doesn't say a peep and then hands in the brilliant paper midway through. Those students really bloom here. And it's really helpful also for students who maybe aren't as strong, because they can see what the other students are doing. And so this approach sort of tends to raise the ante for the whole class. And then, of course, you can publish critical editions with your graduate students or with other scholars. And as I say, that's what we've been doing with my graduate class. You'll meet some of them in the in the breakout room. So we are annotating this text, Clough's Amour de Voyage. And one neat thing is we've been playing with sound. One group, 3 of the students in the class.
Over the great windy waters and over the clear crested summits.
So we've been doing very close analysis of the dactylic hexameter of this particular text. Stacy Smythe, who's here, is an art historian, and so she's been putting together 19th century photographs of the places that are mentioned in this poem, which is set in Rome. And later, we'll port the edition over to editions for peer review and publication. And there you have other tools that you can make available, you can make use of, like this timeline tool you see, or our map tool, which allows you to look closely at the places of significance. You'll see that England looks a little different. That's because we have an 1880s ordnance survey behind it. So you can see what the place looked like then. Eventually, we hope to have many such layers because these can be easily toggled on and off. There's a Google Map API behind it. So it's kind of neat. And then finally, the exhibit builder. And so I showed you those annotations by Stacy Smythe. We're also putting them together in this gallery that will be published alongside the edition. So those are the things we're doing with our edition of Amour de Voyage. And all of this that I've mentioned so far has been COVE Studio. On the COVE edition side, there's a number of things you can do there as well. And you can do this for a critical edition or simply with your students for fun as part of a class. So for example, here is my class on Leonardo da Vinci that I did for the Honors College at Purdue. This is kind of an interesting class because it was mostly made up of scientists and engineers at the Honors College. It's a mix of humanists and STEM people in these interdisciplinary classes. Engineers love Leonardo just as much as humanists do. And so this is my group. That they use these tools to do their initial research, and then we publish the material on the web, not for peer review, just it's available there for people to see. So this is the actual research that the students did on the projects that they were exploring. They created a timeline, they created this map, they created a visual gallery of images tied to the things that they were examining. For example, this student was interested in Renaissance architecture. Leonardo da Vinci did a design for this tuburio that wasn't chosen. And you can interlink the image to a map to a timeline element, so it allows these different pieces of software to work together. And you can keep track of student progress. Those are my students, and you can quickly see that they're all doing more or less the same amount of work. So that's everything. Just as a quick introduction to what COVE does, the difference between COVE Studio and COVE Editions, and some of the tools that we make available. Our goal is to try to take the most robust open source tools and make them available to everyone, so you don't have to be a digital humanist to be able to start making use of the tools. You can do it right away. And our goal is also to try to break the separation between what we do in our research and what we do in our teaching. And the best example of, or the most extreme example of that, is having a graduate class actually build an edition that you then put through peer review and copy editing at COVE. And that's precisely what Lorraine Jansen-Koistra did for our first such edition. And that'll be my handoff to her in her presentation.
Okay, great. I need to share my screen now, so we'll see if I can make that happen. Okay, so thanks for the handoff, Dino. I'm very happy to talk about my experience building a peer-reviewed digital edition with my graduate class back in 2018, when things were still very much, COVE was still in the building process, and so were we. It was one of my best teaching experiences ever, I have to say. It was very exciting and fun, and the students themselves were very positively responsive, although we all agreed it was a ton of work. So I'm going to not do a live demo. I'm going to use screenshots, but I want to stress at the outset that just about everything I'm talking about today, you can go back and look at later if you want. If you go to the teaching section of COVE, there's openly available pedagogical essays by other people who've done, used COVE in their teaching. And I wrote an essay, an essay called Teaching Transformation. That was about our experience as a grad class, reformulated as an editorial board and a group of collaborative editors to produce a digital edition of a little known late Victorian text, Clemens Hausmann's The Werewolf. And the goal, because I'm very keen to have real world effects from student work as much as possible in an experiential way. The goal was to bring the edition through to peer review and possible publication at the end of the course, which was 12 weeks long. So that was a big goal, but we were able to realize it. Second thing I want to note, that on the teaching side of things, I'm going to paint in broad strokes because I've got 15 minutes. I'm not going to get into all the details, but you can find the details. For example, I'm not going to talk about course readings and that sort of thing, but all that material is available on my syllabus, Digital Publishing, which was the course I was teaching. And my assignments and guides for the students are available under teaching resources too. So the COVE teaching section, may be underrated, but it is a gold mine. Go there, and I'm always amazed at the generosity of scholars and the sharing of their teaching, which is as much a passion for them as their research, but we don't always talk about it as much in public. The students, I have to say, were incredibly positive overall. I'm going to incorporate their voices here and there. Just give you a minute to see what they have to say here before moving on. We worked in editorial pairs. Each student was paired with another, and that was their first peer review person for every single assignment before they submitted it to me as editor-in-chief. So they got used to working collaboratively throughout. Our guide was the MLA statement on scholarly editions, particularly digital scholarly editions. And throughout the course, we kept in mind that the goal for our edition was reliability. And that reliability would be judged by the edition's degree of accuracy, adequacy, appropriateness, consistency, and explicitness. So that was the rubric I applied for every assignment. And I gave them a series of scaffolded assignments so that they could gain confidence and knowledge and skills as they went. But by using this same rubric for each one, the students were also internalizing what these editorial principles were and how they would be playing out, why they were important. So the course, I mentioned it was 12 weeks. It went from January to April. After the course was over in May, I submitted the entire edition, which included an annotated primary text of this novella, about a little less than 100 pages long, an editorial essay by each student in the class, as well as by me, and a timeline. So the primary text and a fairly robust editorial apparatus were what constituted our edition. And we submitted it in May. The students agreed to work on revisions as needed throughout the summer. And when they graduated in October, we were able to celebrate the launch of their digital edition at the same time. And I have to say, it was a big motivator to them throughout the course and throughout the summer to think that they might get a peer review publication for their CV at the end of it, in addition to all the skills they gained, both soft and hard skills. So I'm going to go through now the six steps, basically. I'm trying to keep this simple and obviously short so that there's lots of time for questions and discussion, both in our breakout rooms and later in our Q&A. But 6 easy steps. First step, choose the copy text. We had 2 choices. We went to special collections in the library to decide which one copy text we would use. Would we use the first published version of The Werewolf? That would be the magazine version in Atalanta in 1890, where it was the Christmas supplement. And in the good Gothic tradition of Christmas supplements in Britain. And it was illustrated there by Everard Hopkins, who actually was, for those of you who are interested, the brother of the poet. And his illustrations were reproduced not very well, I think, in halftone process. And there was no collaboration between the author and the illustrator. The illustrator was just commissioned by the editor, L.T. Mead, and did his work for the magazine as described. 6 years later, Clemence and her brother, Lawrence Houseman, who was a designer for John Lane at the Bodley Head and an illustrator, brought out The Werewolf in illustrated format as part of the John Lane Bodley Head Belles Lettres series. So it's a beautiful book. It's one of those beautiful 1890s illustrated books, but what makes it especially interesting is the degree of collaboration that went into it. So Clemence Houseman wrote the book, as you know, but she also engraved the illustrations by Lawrence. So that's a very strong degree of collaboration there. And ultimately, we chose the 1896 edition, but not without strife in the editorial team. There were some who felt the first version was the best one, not the last version, et cetera, et cetera. Ultimately, we arrived at a consensus and a compromise. We would use the 1896 text, the Bodley Head text, as our copy text, but we would include textual annotations showing how any variants that were present in the Atalanta version, and we would include all the illustrations by Everard Hopkins in notes at the place where they would have been. as well as, of course, all the Lawrence Houseman ones. So the next step would be, after the copy text was selected, would be to do a document analysis. Document analysis it just identifies the structural chunks, the key features, what an audience is going to need information about, if there's any editorial amendments that need to be done in the transcription process. What about the physical appearance? Are there elements of the physical appearance that need to be captured? And what aspects of the text would benefit from annotation? So the way I did this was I gave each student roughly the same number of pages in this 100-page novella, and they were responsible for that page run in terms of analyzing, the section and annotating that section. And each one of them was also responsible for one image, either one by Lawrence Houseman or one by Everard Hopkins. So as a result of this document analysis, we decided that it was crucial that the images by Lawrence Houseman should appear in the text at the same place on the screen as they did in the page of the book. So that was a little tricky for us to do because perhaps overly ambitiously, we decided we would code the text ourselves in HTML. This is not something I'd recommend. The COVE team has experts in this, and they can prepare you a fine copy text in a remediated form for your annotation. But we did it. It was a good learning experience. Certainly the students gained editorial insight. They understood their object more, their page run, when they marked it up in HTML, and they learned a lot about the remediation process and what it meant to do a digital edition. So, but we were very happy at the end with the approximate facsimile of the image, so of the book. So even though it's a scroll, the images appear at about the same place where they appear in the text. And again, this is before the gallery tool builder was ready. So we had to build our own satellite gallery in Omeka. So when you click on one of these images, it'll take you to the Omeka site, and it'll be bigger and downloadable and all the other things. The COVE annotation tool offers preset filters. So once our edition was up in COVE Studio and annotatable, we could start annotating it, but we had to have our principles in place before we could actually annotate it. So we took up the 5 preset filters: textual, linguistic, historical, cultural, and interpretive annotations, and we explicitly defined them for our purposes. And this is necessary, especially in a collaborative edition, because otherwise people interpret these categories differently. And we needed to be more or less in lockstep in our application of the filters. So, so we defined how we would use each of those filters. And although we included illustrations in the interpretive annotations, we also used the COVE feature that allows you to do a custom tag. So we did a custom tag for illustrations, and that was so that the users could filter just for illustrations if they wanted to, and read those annotations that way. We also, as I mentioned, created a timeline chronology for the werewolf, and the COVE timeline tool is super user-friendly. The students really enjoyed adding historical events and images to it. so much so that they added far more events than were required. So the chronology, again, we had to determine what's our range, but it basically from the first werewolf novel of the Victorian period that we could find occurred, which was 1839, Frederick Marryat's The Phantom Ship, to the death of Lawrence Husband in 1959. That's why we have these, this particular chronology. That was the logic behind that. And we created our own events for the timeline. They were biographical. They were to do with publishing events, political events, the development of the werewolf genre in fiction and film. One of my students was a French Canadian, and she loved being able to add a French Canadian legend published in the fin de siècle on a werewolf story, a werewolf legend. So we created all our own individual entries for the annotations, but you can also very easily import events from existing timelines in COVE or branch. And that is also a wonderful feature of the timeline tool. The last thing the students contributed was to the editorial apparatus, as I've mentioned, was they each wrote a contextual essay. Again, we had to negotiate who got to write what. They had different interests, but they managed to find their own spot, their own sweet spot, if you like, about what they really wanted to write about. And the point of it was to provide brief and accessible contextual essays that would help users. So they were all each about 1,000 words, and they generally fall into two categories. One is the cultural context of the werewolf, such as the publishing history or wood engraving or feminist activism, the new woman, sexual dissidence, that kind of thing. And the other category would be interpretive frameworks, such as religious references, color symbolism, the importance of names and naming, the werewolf archetype, Gothic conventions, those sorts of things. I would say then that the last step is peer review and revision, and except the last step is really use. And so that's where I'm going to land on here, is because this last fall, when we were all teaching remotely, I had the opportunity in my undergrad capstone seminar on Victorian illustrated books to include the werewolf in my syllabus using the COVE edition, which was produced by Ryerson grad students. So now my Ryerson undergrad students, that was one of the books they used, and a couple of them chose to create digital exhibits instead of writing an essay on the werewolf. And this particular one is on wood engraving and the werewolf, but another student created one on the werewolf and the new woman. So that was very special moment for me to see, and for the students to see that they were all part of a larger scholarly conversation and making real world contributions with their work, not just submitting essays for a grade. So would I do this again? Absolutely. Would I recommend it? Yes. Very rewarding, enriching experience for the students and for me. The students learned scholarly digital editing by doing scholarly digital editing. They helped troubleshoot the COVE toolset in its early days, and they felt a real sense of contributing to that scholarly community through their beta testing. They really enjoyed that. They also felt very chuffed about getting publications, getting real readers in the world for their research and writing. And we all felt a real collective pride knowing that our open access COVE edition made Clemens Hausman's The Werewolf accessible to classrooms. around the world, including, as it turned out, my own undergrad classroom at Ryerson. So here you can see that they had many varied and positive feelings about the course. And I'll just give a pause at the end here to let my students have the last word.
Thanks a lot, Lorraine. One thing that's kind of interesting about Lorraine's project, I'll just mention this quickly. So one of the ideas is that the term we're using is open assembly, so that once you create, say, a timeline or a gallery, each of the elements within the timeline and within a gallery has its own URL and exists to be imported into other timelines, other customized timelines, galleries, etc. And what happened after Clemens Hausman's The Werewolf publication, Laura Rotuno, who's at Penn State Altoona, did a class on feminism and suffrage and built a timeline with her class, but she was able to interweave into her timeline, even before they got going, elements from Lorraine's edition, elements from Branch timeline, which are there available as vetted elements. Okay, I'll pass it over to Rebecca. Next, you can go ahead and share your screen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll share my screen in a minute. So I put together an edition that's still in progress. The first installment and a lot of the editorial paratext is now peer-reviewed and published, of a work called A Mystery in Scarlet, which is a penny dreadful by James Malcolm Rymer, who's now most famous as the creator of Sweeney Todd and the early vampire character Varney the Vampire, in two of his other penny dreadfuls. So A Mystery in Scarlet from 1866 was important to me and I think to a lot of other scholars, because it was very highly praised by Robert Louis Stevenson in one of his essays in Scribner's Magazine, in which he said that Rymer, whom he knew via his pseudonym M.J. Aram, and this text, A Mystery in Scarlet in particular, were very influential for Stevenson, and that he had lost his copy of A Mystery in Scarlet, and he wanted the readers of Scribner's to help him to access another one so that he could read it again, because he remembered how much he had enjoyed it, and that ultimately he was successful in that pursuit. And I wanted to create an edition of this because there isn't one. You'd think there would be, given Stevenson's cultural importance and also to some extent Rymerism that we're undergoing right now, a kind of critical recovery of Victorian penny fiction, which was the pleasure reading of the Victorian mass public. It was far more widely read than almost anything else. So you should, think that certainly our grad students and maybe even our undergraduates ought to know about it. And what really has held that back is the exact kind of institutional problems of the academic publishing industry that Dino told us about at the beginning of today's workshop. That I knew from other scholars of penny dreadfuls that they had directly run into some of those problems when trying to publish editions of far more better known ones. So I really saw COVE as a way of making this material accessible to scholars, to graduate students, and to undergraduates, and even to pleasure readers, because of course it had first appeared and been extremely successful as recreational reading of people who did not consider themselves literary professionals. And I see this as a way of democratizing the curriculum that we've talked a great deal, especially over the past year, since that LRB essay came out, about the necessity to decolonize a curriculum that is still very white and very imperialist. I think we also need to democratize the curriculum in terms of class, which is a pursuit that overlaps with the decolonization of the curriculum. And one way in which we need to do that is to find new formats in order to, to make this the neglected material accessible. And I think that's particularly problematic for sharing texts that originally came from Victorian periodicals and that appeared in serial format. The scholar James Mussel has said that the digital world offers us new opportunities to view Victorian periodicals that if you don't have access to a research library, you might not have had before. But also that the way that they're situated in the new digital context, to quote Mussel, including the interface, that really determines how they're discovered or if they're discovered and how they're read. So I think that COVE editions just offered a wonderful way to make a Victorian serial accessible that the traditional print critical edition really doesn't. Just to demonstrate what we're working with here. This is a Penny Dreadful. This is it looks very much like, it's not a Mystery in Scarlet, but it looks like a Mystery in Scarlet. This is one installment of the leading serial, part of periodicals. This is one issue of the periodical with the leading serial, beginning on the front page, with its illustration that would have looked very attractive to Victorian recreational readers in the window at the newsagent. And so, so that is as much about the illustration, if not more about the illustration than it is about the text. It's something that occurs in serial format in multiple parts, and that we need to be aware of that multi-part type structure. And we also need to be aware of what else might be sharing the page with each installment of this story. And all of that is just very difficult to do in a print edition. There have been some attempts to create print critical editions of penny parts issues, so not ones that are part of periodicals where, there's nothing except the story and the illustrations of Penny Dreadful. So either you get, collector's volumes that really no one can access anymore, like this one of Varney the Vampire from the 1970s, or you get something that is cheap and accessible and teachable and has a good introduction, like this edition by Rohan McWilliam of Sweeney Todd or The String of Pearls, Reimer's most famous work, but it doesn't have any illustrations because that's not affordable, which really removes a lot of the content of the Penny Dreadful. Or you have something that has the text and the illustrations, like this facsimile edition of Reimer's The Black Monk by Kurt Hare, which looks like a phone book and is a very intimidating behemoth, baggy monster, and is probably going to be quite, intimidating to some readers. You kind of maybe have to already be very excited about that, and there's no space for any annotations because it's a facsimile and it's already that length. So COVE seemed to offer a solution to all of those problems because with the Creative Commons license, I could put up all of the illustrations. I could put them up in a way where you could see where they're situated on the page at the front of this leading, as the leading serial under the masthead of the magazine in which they appeared, Reimer's The London Miscellany. And then you could read the text that had been properly typed up and corrected, and the annotations, and as Dino has pointed out, even have pictures and other kinds of media within the annotations. So the hypertextuality of COVE made this a really appealing way to create a critical edition of a genre that thus far had seemingly resisted easy transition into really accessible critical editions. And of course that would be very economical, if not free, for most of our students. So, it would be completely free if you just want to read it on COVE editions, and a little bit more if you want to, and to add some annotations yourself. So when I put this together, the copy text came from the Lilly Library at the University of Indiana. So they actually have two different editions of A Mystery in Scarlet. One, they have two numbers of the London Miscellany with the story on the front cover, beginning on the front cover, and they also have a complete bound edition of all of the numbers of the miscellany in which it appeared. So I derived the images from both of those, and they were willing to let that be published on the COVE, in part because of its open access policy. And I use the gallery function to really highlight the episodic nature of a serial publication like this, and that's what I'm going to show you right now. So this is the exhibit that constitutes my edition of A Mystery in Scarlet. So you see a thumbnail preview of each of the front pages of the numbers of the London Miscellany that contains A Mystery in Scarlet. So you can actually browse this edition in the same way that many Victorian recreational readers would have, by looking at the front cover first and seeing, well, is that a number that I would like to read? So you've got the illustration on the front cover and the first page of the text, and you can look at each of the numbers in which A Mystery in Scarlet appeared this way, and then choose one to read. So you don't necessarily have to read it in order. It can be as nonlinear an experience as it was for the Victorian reader. There's one number in which A Mystery in Scarlet was not the leading serial, something else was, and its installment appeared in about the middle of that number of the London Miscellany. I believe that was because the illustration might not have been ready on time. That was what sometimes happened. And it's important to focus on the illustrations, I think, because the illustrator was actually even more famous than the author. So the illustrator of A Mystery in Scarlet was Hablo Knight Brown, or Fizz, far more famous, obviously, for his illustration of a lot of Dickens. This was produced closer to the end of his career and in wood engraving, a medium he did not enjoy working in. But to publish this without the illustrations, or to make it so you couldn't browse it by the illustrations, would probably not be giving him his due. So if you scroll down, you can look at each installment as its own kind of defined work. You can read, I've provided synopses of each of these installments, so you can read them episode by episode. Again, you can look at the illustration first, or go straight to the text. Again, it begins with the image of that front page with the cover illustration on it. But then you've got an edition of the text itself, and it's annotated using the COVE platform. So you can find out things like, when it says that Malcolm J. Urim is also the author of all of these texts, what are they and what are they about? These are all penny Bloods and Dreadfuls that he wrote from the 1840s to the 1860s. This particular story, A Mystery in Scarlet, fits into the court mysteries genre of penny fiction that was popularized by Reimer's sometime employer, G.W.M. Reynolds, which means there's lots of references to Hanoverian royal history, to places at court, at the court of St. James, at what was then Kew Palace, and to all sorts of material culture that probably won't be very familiar to today's undergraduates. So, there are annotations of all of that, and some of them have pictures. So we can see the things that Reimer may have been able to encounter through mediums such as engravings and museums when he was writing this. So I'm hoping that this is going to, the COVE's gallery function, the ability to create an edition that isn't necessarily linear, that can be read in any order, that can be read with the pictures first or with all the pictures at once, helps to shake up this belief that the penny blood and the penny dreadful cannot be translated easily into a critical edition, much less an undergraduate edition. In fact, right now, I'm teaching the first installment of this edition to my undergraduate students. And I'm getting some wonderful reactions to it. This is a gen ed course. It's a 200 level course. Most students in it are not going to be English majors. I've taught with the COVE many times to English majors, and they love the COVE, and they write brilliant stuff in the annotations, and they've even collaborated with students in a classroom at a different university through the COVE, annotating the same text together. But these undergraduate students, general education member students who are going into fields like business and nursing primarily, the ones who were afraid of elite texts like Frankenstein, which was the last novel that we read, really took to A Mystery in Scarlet. They understood what was going on. They pointed out cliffhangers. They pointed out more nuanced observations as well, but it's really made me think. I knew that penny fiction was accessible to a general public in the Victorian era. I thought it was going to be culturally distant for students in our own era, and the COVE has shown me that maybe that's not so, and maybe this actually is a really interesting entry point into Victorian literature for students who don't feel terribly confident in their ability to read old stuff or stuff from Britain. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's the interface of the COVE that is helping them to access it. I think that's a strong possibility. I don't know if it's my annotations. It might be the illustrations, exactly as it was for Victorian audiences, that's a really, a strong point of entry for the text. But whatever it is, I'm really glad that I had the gallery building function in order to create this edition that they're reacting to in ways that I really hadn't anticipated, but I'm really happy about. So if you want to learn how to use the gallery function to edit multipartite texts, I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that, because it's really exciting. And in particular, I hope that those with graduate students, I don't have graduate students, might be interested in contributing to the critical revolution regarding penny literature, penny bloods and penny dreadfuls, by creating more COVE gallery editions of those genres. Thank you.
What I propose is that if you have a question, that you use the raise hand function. You'll see it under, if you click on participants, you'll see it there under the list of participants. And you can feel free to use the chat as well if there's a specific question that wasn't addressed. And while you're thinking about your questions, I'll just respond to two things that Rebecca said. So that is one of our goals. She mentioned what some have called undisciplining the Victorian field and other fields. And that is something that COVE is going to do actively next year. We've already had a commitment of a full year research assistantship from Purdue School of Interdisciplinary Studies that will just be dedicated to encoding texts by Black, Indigenous, people of color authors. We already are doing pretty well and have a number of texts. In fact, the text that Rebecca did with her colleague at Loyola, was Mary Seacole's Wonderful Adventures. And then she was able to link the two classes to do the annotations. But the goal will be, and we're trying to get additional grants to support that work so that we can increase our BIPOC content by hopefully as much as 1 million words. That's our goal. So that's all coming up next year. And the other thing, anything can be an addition. So it can be just a gallery. And in fact, for example, Beverly Rillet has one edition that's just images of George Eliot, and brought together a number of images that are not readily known of George Eliot. It could be just a timeline. It could be just a map. So although we don't have examples of that yet. So you can be creative in how you assemble these editions. We're calling them omnibus editions because you can pick which tools make sense for the edition that you yourself are putting together, and then assemble them together in the COVE editions space. Does anybody have Ben? So Ben's a good example here of the flexibility of this tool, because he's in the process of actually putting together an edition with his high school. Do you want to talk about that?
I would be happy to. And then I have a question about the peer review process as well. My students and I are putting together a critical edition of a poem published in 1795 that has never been printed since, or read perhaps. It's called Bath and Adumbration in Rhyme, but it matters because it describes the city of Bath just 2 years before Jane Austen would have visited it for the first time. That was the visit that on which she based much of Northanger Abbey. So our claim is that John Matthews, the poet that we're studying, matters because Austen matters. He also represents a satirical tradition that Austen would have been aware of, satires of Bath, a tradition that she greatly improved upon as well. So we thought that would be useful for lovers and readers of Jane Austen to know about. As far as the experience, it's been a ton of work, way more than I was expecting. And the students have brought like a great deal of creativity and enthusiasm to the project, and it's definitely better for their participation. But just to be real, I have to do a lot of it myself, and I definitely have to check all their work. When they submit some prose, I can take pieces of it, but I've got to like do a lot of writing myself. So that would be my what I would add to the beautiful presentations of Lorraine and Rebecca. Is super rewarding, fantastic for the students to have the chance to work with a real audience in mind, but kind of know what you're signing up for. Expect to do a lot of work beyond what you would do for a typical class. I guess that's what I would say. My question for you primarily, Dina, would be: could you give any more insight on what on navigating the peer review process in particular? It sounds like COVE's pretty omnivorous in the kinds of texts and editions it considers, but are there certain like core values that that those of us who would like to submit for peer review should keep in mind?
Yeah, well, I can share with you, I don't know if I did yet, the guidelines that we give to our peer reviewers, but basically a big part of the edition is, as it is with anything that you publish in print as well, is the editorial introduction, which functions as a sort of contract between you and your readers, where you clarify, what is your intended audience? Is it just a reader's edition, or especially directed to undergraduates? Is it like a Norton critical edition? What exactly is it that you're attempting to do? Are you doing something different than people have done in the past, and why? So that's sort of again, the contract that you're making with your peer reviewers, and I'll share you what we do with that. I can say that an important part of this is just being good at linking texts and authors with peer reviewers, and that's just something I've gotten good at because I've done, I think, Branch's 1.25 million words of material, and I did the Encyclopedia of Victorian Literature, which was another 1 million words. That's a lot of all of it put through peer review, so that's a lot. That means that I have this really good database to try to link up people. So I try to make the process as helpful as possible. Rebecca, did you have something to add to that? Did I see your hand?
I wanted to add that, like, the peer review process was actually one of the more rewarding peer review processes I've ever been through. When you submit your edition, you also submit a form in which you explain what some of your editorial intentions are, and that is passed on to the peer reviewers. So it's really being judged according to what your goals and your intended audience and intended uses are. And the peer reviews that I received really responded to the goals that I had on that form. There were some things that they wanted changed, and I changed those things. And it was a really inspiring peer review process, because everything that they said, this should be done a little bit differently. A big one was, can we see more of the London miscellany, not just A Mystery in Scarlet, but what was alongside it, because we know how important context was in Victorian periodicals. And then I created a link to a newly created Google Book scan of it that had been locked up, previous to this project, but the University of Indiana University was happy to unlock. And so, I mean, it was something that I thought, oh, I should have thought of that myself. I'm really glad that that the peer reviewer did. And I also received my peer review, and I think it was January of or February of 2020. So right before, I was aware of the pandemic starting right before it all radically changed our lives at the beginning of March. And I think like the fact that the peer reviewer was so enthusiastic about this edition and had really constructive ideas for how to revise it for publication actually kept me working on it through the craziness of that semester. And that summer, like I honestly, without that, I don't know if I would have prioritized this, during 2020. But the COVE, I mean, and it's something about the COVE community. Like this is part of our big COVE project, and this needs to be done. So it was a good experience.
And again, we do really try to make this a collective. So a lot of the ways we're approaching this is to try to share ideas and things like the teaching essays that Lorraine pointed out, or the sharing of the teaching resources, and just the sharing of the content in this open assembly way that we're discussing. So I see, Alexis, you have a hand up, but also there was a good question that follows from this from Ken Daly. He says, thanks for your presentations and hoping Lorraine can address her strategies for managing student work, evaluating and editing within just 12 weeks, completing all the annotations and collations of variants so quickly so that you can submit for peer review. This is something that we've been addressing in our class as well. I don't know if any of my students want to talk about this, but we've established benchmarks for ours where we try to have all of the annotations for there's 5 cantos in ours, done by a certain time. And we broke up the work so that one team is more responsible for the timeline. Two scholars, Alyssa and Ayla, are more dedicated to the map. Stacy Smite is more dedicated to the gallery and the art history behind it. And so by sharing the work and really thinking about what the logic of that was, trying not to put too much of a burden on any one person, we started by reading articles about the dangers of doing faculty, graduate student collaborations, and the possibility of being exploitative in that relationship. So we had those conversations in the hope that we could come up with a really effective mechanism. Lorraine, did you want to say anything more about that, since you were directly addressed by Ken?
Yeah, sure. Very happy to. So if you look at my syllabus on the for digital publishing on the teaching section of COVE, you'll see that I've lined up an editorial workflow that there's 2 columns. One is editorial workflow and one is kind of assignments. And the 2 kind of relate together all the way through the 12 weeks. It was fairly intensive. Every week they had something to do, but it was also scaffolded because it built upon each other. And there was a timeline that allowed them to write their annotation or whatever it was, give it to their peer editor for review, and then revise it before submitting it to me. So there was a whole process there in which we were always involved. We also discussed things like, well, we plan to do a map, but maybe we don't need to do a map. We'll take that out and adjust our schedule, because we realized, that we didn't need it for what we were doing. We were focusing more on the text as it stood historically in Scandinavia, rather than trying to map larger things. We could dispense with that and put more time into our other annotations. Because they were each allotted, and not the whole text, but a page run of maybe 12 pages each for their annotations. And out of that and out of our discussions, they developed, their ideas about what they wanted to research and write about for the contextual essay, and that also mapped onto their timeline event thing. It was all integrated in ways that made it doable. But I would, as I said before, part of the workflow included and digitizing and encoding the primary text, the source text, that's too much. Don't do that. Don't try to do that in 12 weeks as well.
Yeah, you've got to pick your battles, and setting groups helps a lot. So for example, we have a group of 3 students who are dealing with the audio that I showed you, because that takes a lot of time to make the MP4 clips and incorporate them into the annotations. 2 people were just in charge of the map. 2 people are in charge of biographical, reading all the biographies of Clough so that they could do a paratextual essay there. Really, Monica, who's also helping us here, along with Yao, who are both COVE RAs here. Monica actually is the only one working on her own, so everybody else is paired up. And Monica's doing textual variants. That was what she was interested in doing, since we chose the first edition of Clough's Amour de Voyage, which is not regularly anthologized. Somebody asked about institutional subscription before everybody takes off, because I know we're past time now. Don't hesitate to email me if that's something that interests you. This is a real significant way you can help COVE, because that's our long-term sustainability strategy. But Alexis, I know you've had your hand up for a while. Would you ask your question?
I'm sorry to ask a question so late in the meeting, but has anybody had any experience working with students and sending them off to work in COVE projects more independently or in self-directed ways, rather than, because I'm in week 3 of a 9-week quarter already. So all of the things that you've shared sound, like somebody said in the chat, very inspirational, and my mind is kind of reeling with the possibilities of COVE. But for this quarter, I'm kind of interested in figuring out a way to, dip my feet into it without creating a syllabus built around a COVE project.
Yeah, well, it's designed to make that possible. So any student can go in and build his or her own anthology, or could create an edition and start annotating a given text, can upload a text if that's what they want to do. And then also within COVE editions, you can create a class project, but how you approach what you build is completely up to you. You can do it as a collective class project, which is how I do usually do it, but you could also have, say, 3 students building a timeline together. They'll just appear as separate timelines within that space. So the goal, and our approach is to be completely, agnostic in how we think about what's being presented, just so that you can, play around a little bit.
If you want, Alexis, if I can just add, if you want to do a fairly simple thing with your students, I'd say create a group in COVE editions and have them do a timeline of your course texts or something like that.
And it's nice to have them do it together, because it's really neat to see something actually pretty significant grow very quickly if it's a number of people pulling it together at the same time. So we're about 7 minutes over the allotted time. So I'd suggest that we close shop here. I know that there are a few questions that came up in the chat that we haven't had a chance to address. So I'll look those over. I'll save the chat and I'll respond to those directly by email. I'll try to make the video available as well. And I don't hesitate to email me or email coveeditions@gmail.com if you have any questions. We try to respond whenever people have questions. We try to support people who are doing this either for a class or for research. And as Lorraine said, we're also very happy to, as long as we have capacity, to encode the text for you and prepare your base text for you, aided by the RAs like Yao, like Monica, like the ones that Ryerson provides us, for example. They are trained and they know what they're doing. And they have oversight as well from our admin directors, including Ken Crowell, who I saw join here. And we have 6 admin directors, each in charge of different things. Our goal is to try to create a proper infrastructure. It's not easy. We're a nonprofit, and obviously we have a lot of competition from presses who have very deep pockets that we do not, but we do our best to be supportive. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.